If you've ever lost someone and thought you knew exactly who they were, this story will make you question everything you assumed. Stay with us to the end, because what Claudette found inside that old motel wasn't just a box of forgotten things. It was the story of a life her mother had been living in secret, quietly for 40 years. And if this is your first time here, welcome to Ultra Stories. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what comes next. Claudette Marsh was 53 years old the morning. She drove 3 hours north of Ottawa to close up the Pinewood Rest Motel, and she had exactly $412 in her checking account. That was it. That was everything. The divorce had been finalized in March. The house in Canada had sold in April. Technically a good sale, the agent had told her, practically glowing, but by the time the lawyers were paid, and Gerald's share was sorted and the line of credit was cleared, Claudette walked away with enough to cover 2 months of rent on a basement apartment in Nepean and a second-hand Civic that needed new tires. Her daughter Paige had offered to lend her money. Claudette had declined 3 times before she stopped being asked. She wasn't proud. She was just tired. Tired in a way that had settled into her bones sometime around the 2nd year of the marriage falling apart, and hadn't really left since. Her mother, Sylvie Marsh, had died in February. A stroke, fast, which the doctor had called a mercy. Claudette wasn't sure she agreed. Fast meant no warning. Fast meant Claudette had been at a Costco in Bell's Corners, buying bulk paper towels when it happened, and by the time her phone rang she was already too late to say anything at all. Sylvie had owned the Pinewood Rest for 31 years. A 16-room motel off Highway 17 north of Renfrew, surrounded by white pine and Canadian shield rock and not much else. It had never been glamorous. It had never been full. But Sylvie had kept it running. Slowly, stubbornly. The way she kept everything running. And when she died she left it to Claudette in a will that had been written out by hand and witnessed by 2 women from her curling club. There was no cash. There was no savings account Claudette didn't know about. There was a motel with a leaking roof on Unit 7 and a boiler that had been jury-rigged by the same plumber every spring for 15 years. Claudette had spent 3 weeks telling herself she'd deal with it later. Then she called a realtor. Then she drove north. The gravel lot was empty when she pulled in. The office light had been left on. Her mother had always left it on, even the last few years when she was barely taking bookings, and in the gray April morning, with the pines still bare, and the lake behind the property flat and steel-colored. It looked exactly like what it was, a place that had reached the end of something. Claudette sat in the car for 4 minutes before she went inside. The office smelled like her mother. That was the first thing that got her. The particular mix of Sylvie's hand lotion and old wood, and the faint burnt smell of the coffee maker that ran on a timer, and made 8 cups every morning at 6, whether anyone was there to drink it or not. The pot was empty now, long since evaporated to a dark ring on the glass, but the smell was still there. Claudette stood at the front desk and didn't move for a moment. Then she put on her coat, found a box of black garbage bags under the sink, and got to work. She started with the easy things. The paperwork on the desk, the filing cabinet that contained 30 years of guest logs and tax receipts, and a folder labeled important that turned out to hold mostly expired warranties. She found her mother's reading glasses in 3 different locations. She found a coffee mug that said Renfrew in Bloom from a fair that Claudette dimly remembered attending as a child, maybe 1982. She found a shoebox in the back closet containing exactly 47 birthday cards. 1 for each year Claudette had been alive. She had sent maybe 20 of them. Her mother had kept all 47. That was when the crying started, and Claudette let it go for a while before she wiped her face and kept moving. She made 2 trips to the car with bags. She found a small pile of cash in the desk drawer, $640, presumably from the last few bookings, and put it in her jacket pocket, feeling simultaneously grateful and sad. She reorganized the cleaning supplies under the front desk. She stripped the bed in the back office where her mother had slept when she stayed late, which Claudette now realized had been most nights for the last several years. By 2 in the afternoon she had gotten through the office and the first 4 units. She was working through Unit 6 when she noticed the boiler room door. She had walked past it 3 times. The 4th time she stopped. The door was at the end of the hallway, connecting the back office to the utility corridor, a heavy metal door, painted over so many times the hinges had thickened with paint, and it took 2 hands and a solid pull to open it. Claudette had been inside exactly once before years ago, when the plumber had wanted to show her mother something about the pressure gauge. It was not a place anyone spent time in voluntarily. But the door had a padlock on it. A new one. A heavy brass lock. The kind you buy at a Canadian Tire when you mean it. And that was wrong, because Claudette could not remember a lock ever being on that door. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to find the keys. She found them on the third try. A small key ring with 2 keys, tucked inside the false bottom of a tea tin on the office shelf. A hiding spot so exactly like something Sylvie would do that Claudette felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest that took a moment to pass. The padlock opened on the first try. The boiler room was what it had always been. Concrete floor, exposed pipes. The big old boiler hunched in the corner, smelling of rust and mineral water, and the particular damp of a basement that has been wet and dried and wet again too many times. The plumber's notes were still taped to the side of the boiler in her mother's handwriting. The single overhead bulb threw yellow light over everything. And in the corner, behind a plywood panel that Claudette would have assumed was a wall, because it looked exactly like a wall, was the same gray as the concrete blocks beside it, was a space. She almost missed it. She was looking at the boiler, thinking about the cost of replacing it, when she noticed that the shadow behind the plywood was wrong. Too deep. She went over and pushed, and the panel swung inward on 2 small hinges. It was a crawl space. Maybe 4 feet wide, 6 feet deep, low enough that Claudette had to crouch to get in. Along one wall, someone had built a simple wooden shelf, and on that shelf were 2 things: a green metal cash box, the kind you buy at Staples, with a combination lock, and a binder, thick 3-ring, the kind that schools sell for $1.50, filled with pages. Claudette took them both out to the hallway and sat down on the concrete floor with her back against the wall, and her legs stretched out in front of her, because there was no chair and she had stopped caring about her coat. The cash box first. She tried the combination 0000, nothing. She tried her mother's birthday, 1949, nothing. She tried Claudette's own birthday, 1972. The lock turned inside, $3,200 in mixed bills, mostly 20s, a folded piece of paper, and a key, a small, old-fashioned key with a round bow, the kind that opens a post office box. The folded paper was a note in her mother's handwriting. 2 sentences. For Claudette when she needs it most. She will know what to do. Claudette read it twice. Then she set it down and opened the binder. Now, before we go further, we want you to take a moment and think about what you'd expect to find. Money records maybe. A hidden deed. Some secret the motel was sitting on. Because that's what we expected too. But what Sylvie Marsh had been keeping behind that plywood panel was something no one who knew her. Not Claudette. Not the regulars who came back summer after summer. Not the women at the curling club would ever have guessed. It was a ledger, but not the kind that tracks revenue. The binder was organized by year, going back to 1994. Each entry was a name, a date, a room number, and a note. Not guest records, those were kept in the front desk log. These were something else. September 1994. Room 11, Patricia W. traveling alone with 2 children. No money for fuel, said she'd sleep in the car. Gave her room 11 for 4 nights, no charge. Left a bag of groceries at the door each morning. Never asked for thanks. March 1997. Room 3, man would not give his name. Walked in from the highway, February, boots in March, no coat. Fed him, let him stay a week. He fixed the gutter on Unit 4 before he left. Never did catch his name. July 2001. Room 8. Young woman, maybe 19. Black eye she tried to cover with makeup. Stayed 10 days. I called Sheila at the shelter in Renfrew. Gave the number, left it under the door. She was gone when I checked in the morning. I hope she used it. Page after page. 41 entries over 30 years. People in trouble. People in transit. People who had reached the end of something on a Tuesday night on Highway 17 and found themselves pulling into a gravel lot where the office light was on. Sylvie had never turned one of them away. She had never told a single person. Not Claudette. Not anyone. Some of the entries had follow-up notes, added later in lighter ink, called to say she found a place, good, or saw his name in the Renfrew paper, started work at the mill, good, or simply gone, hope, good. One entry near the back, 2019, had a longer note than the others. November 2019. Room 2, man named Terrence, maybe 65, said he'd lost his job in Pembroke and couldn't get back on his feet. Stayed 3 weeks. He was embarrassed about it every single day. Told him, everyone gets cold sometimes. That's what the light is for. He cried. I made him tea. He painted the trim on units 9 through 12 before he left. Never took a cent for it. Claudette sat on the concrete floor of the boiler room hallway and read every single page. It took a long time. The light in the corridor was bad. Her back started hurting. She didn't move. Here's what Claudette had known about her mother. Sylvie Marsh was practical. Sylvie was unsentimental. Sylvie drove a sensible car and wore sensible shoes and thought that most of what people called feelings were just tiredness in disguise. She was not cold. She had been present at every school concert, every volleyball tournament, every painful high school moment. Claudette had wanted to get through alone. But she was not demonstrative. She was not the mother who said "I love you" on a Tuesday for no reason. She was the mother who showed up with a casserole the week after Gerald moved out, stayed for 40 minutes, said "You're going to be fine." Claudette with such complete certainty that Claudette had actually believed her, and then left. That was the Sylvie Marsh that Claudette had known. And that woman, the practical, sensible, casserole-bringing woman, had spent 30 years quietly keeping a light on in a motel office on Highway 17, so that anyone who needed it would know somebody was awake. And she had never said a word about it to anyone. Claudette thought about all the times she had gently suggested that her mother sell the pinewood. The upkeep was too much. The revenue wasn't worth it. You could buy something smaller, Mom. Closer to the city. Closer to me. Sylvie had always said the same thing. I'm fine where I am. Now Claudette understood what that meant. She stayed that night in Unit 2. She didn't plan to. She had meant to drive back to Ottawa by dark. But by the time she'd finished reading the binder, it was past 5, and there was something she couldn't name that made her unwilling to leave. She made coffee in the little unit kitchenette, and sat at the small table by the window, and looked out at the parking lot, and the pines beyond it, going dark blue in the dusk. And she thought about her mother for a long time. She thought about Gerald too, not with anger anymore, mostly with a tired bewilderment that had replaced the anger sometime in the last year. She thought about the apartment in Nepean, and the $412, and the years that had somehow compacted themselves into this particular moment. Sitting alone in her dead mother's motel, 53 years old, trying to figure out what came next. The pinewood was not worth much. The realtor had been gently honest about that. A 16-room motel on a provincial highway with a leaking roof and an aging boiler and no restaurant attached. The market for that was limited. She'd get the land value, mostly. Maybe enough to clear her debts and start over with something small. Claudette looked at the light on the office porch. Her mother had left it on every night, even in February, even when there were no bookings. It burned over the door like a small, steady fact. She thought about Patricia W. and her 2 children in September 1994. She thought about the man with February boots in March. She thought about the young woman with the covered black eye who had gotten a phone number slipped under her door and was gone by morning, and about whom Sylvie had written. Quietly, "I hope she used it." Claudette got up and called her daughter. "Before we tell you what Claudette found in the post office box, and there is something in the post office box, we'll get to that, we want to ask you something. Think about someone in your life who showed up quietly, not with speeches, just with a casserole on a bad week, or a light left on. Drop their name in the comments. We read every single one, and if you're new here, subscribe. Stories like this are why we started Ultra Stories. Paige was 31 and lived in Hamilton and had her mother's practicality and none of her reserve, which had always made family conversations either very efficient or very loud. When Claudette told her about the binder, haltingly, stopping twice, Paige was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She never told you any of it?" Not a word. Another silence. Then, "Mom, I know. She was doing that for 30 years. 41 people," Claudette said, "that I know of. She might not have written them all down." Paige made a sound that was not quite a word. Then she said, "What are you going to do?" And Claudette, who hadn't known the answer to that question for the better part of a year, said, "I don't know yet, but I don't think I'm selling it." She was not impractical about it. That matters, because it would be easy to assume that Claudette made a decision in the heat of emotion, and then had to live with it. That's not what happened. What happened was that she drove back to Ottawa the next morning, and spent 2 weeks doing what she should have done some months ago, actually looking at the numbers. She called the realtor and got an honest figure. She called the plumber and got an honest figure for the boiler. She found a contractor who came out and looked at the roof on Unit 7 and gave her a number that was unpleasant but not catastrophic. She looked at what the pinewood had made in a slow year, and it had been a slow year, and even then it was not nothing. Snowmobilers in January, hunting groups in the fall, the occasional summer family that preferred quiet water to a resort. She added it up 6 times. She got a different number each time, which told her she was either bad at math or refusing to look at the result. She had a conversation with Paige that lasted 2.5 hours and covered everything from the boiler to Claudette's apartment lease, to a vague and eventually concrete idea that Paige had been quietly holding for years about leaving Hamilton and doing something different. That conversation ended with Paige saying, "If you're actually doing this, I want to help." Claudette called the bank. She called the accountant who had done her mother's taxes, a quiet man named Bud, who had been driving out to Renfrew to do Sylvie's books for 20 years, and who teared up slightly when Claudette mentioned the binder. He said, "She never told me either, but I wondered sometimes. Some of those rooms were occupied for no revenue I could account for." He paused. "I always just filed it as a loss." The post office box, it turned out, was at the Renfrew post office. Her mother's box, one of the old brass ones on the wall, and inside it was a letter that had been forwarded 3 times before landing there, from a woman named Arlene, who had stayed in room 11 in September 1994. With 2 children and no money for fuel, the letter was dated January of the previous year. Arlene had tracked down the Pinewood through some combination of memory and determination, and the Canada 4111 website, and she had written to say that she was a grandmother now, and that her daughter, one of the 2 children from that September, was a nurse at the Pembroke Regional Hospital, and that she had told that story, the story of the woman at the motel who had left groceries at the door, to her daughter, and her daughter had told it to her own children, and that she had been wanting to write this letter for 25 years and had finally done it. "I don't know why you did what you did," Arlene had written at the end, "but I know that we would not have made it through that month without you. Some kindnesses change the road ahead. Yours changed mine." Claudette read the letter sitting in the Renfrew post office, standing at the wall of brass boxes with her coat still on, and she stayed there for a while before she folded it carefully and put it in her pocket. She signed the papers to take over the Pinewood Rest in June. It was not a triumphant moment. There was no music playing. The bank had been more cautious than encouraging, and the loan terms were tight, and the list of things that needed fixing was still longer than the list of things that didn't. Paige was driving up on the weekends to help, and they had repainted the office in a pale yellow that Claudette had chosen partly because it was cheerful and partly because it was on sale, and the boiler had been properly overhauled and would no longer require the seasonal prayer that her mother had apparently been offering it for the better part of a decade. The Pinewood was not going to make anyone rich. Claudette knew that. But she had started keeping the log. Not the same binder. She had put that one carefully in the cedar chest that had been her mother's, wrapped in tissue. But a new one, same format. Name if given, date, room number, note. She had used it twice since June. Once for a young couple who had run out of gas 40 kilometers from Renfrew and had approximately $11 between them. Once for an older man from Sudbury who had come south for a funeral and couldn't afford to stay anywhere and had been sitting in his truck in her lot at 9:30 at night, trying to decide what to do. She had fed him. She had given him room 6. He had stayed 2 nights and left a note on the desk that said, "Thank you. I won't forget this place." She had taped it to the wall behind the front desk. It was the first thing she saw in the morning. On a Thursday in early September, one of those Canadian September days that can't decide if it's still summer or already fall, warm in the sun and cool in the shade, and the maples just starting to think about going orange. A woman pulled into the Pinewood lot at 4:30 in the afternoon. She was maybe 45. She drove an older Corolla that was carrying more than a car that size should have to carry. Bags and boxes visible through the back windows. The kind of loaded-up look that means someone is between places in a larger sense than just driving. She came into the office and asked for a room, and then she looked at the rate Claudette quoted her, and something shifted in her face. A small, fast calculation that Claudette recognized instantly, because she had made the same calculation herself not so long ago. "Is that for one night?" the woman said carefully. "Or the week," Claudette said. "Same rate applies." The woman, her name was Colette, she said. Colette from Timmins, heading toward Kingston to stay with her sister while things got sorted out, looked at Claudette for a moment. "I might need a few days," she said. "Room 4 has a kitchenette," Claudette said. "And there's a Tim Hortons in Renfrew if you need it, but I generally make coffee at 6, and there's always extra if you're up." Colette looked at her again. Then she nodded and reached for her wallet. Claudette took what she offered, which was not the full amount, and did not say anything about it. That night, after Colette's light went out in room 4, Claudette went into the office and wrote in the new binder, September, room 4, Colette from Timmins, between places. 3 days. Coffee each morning. She closed the binder and looked out at the parking lot. The office porch light was on, throwing a small pale circle on the gravel. She had asked the electrician, when he came to rewire Unit 7, to put the porch light on a separate switch from everything else. She wanted to be able to leave it on independently, no matter what. He had looked at her oddly. "It's just a light," he said. "I know," Claudette Marsh said. "Leave it on a separate switch." He did. And every night since, whether there were guests or not, whether the books balanced or not, whether the day had been good, or the kind of day that makes you sit in the kitchen for a long time after supper, not quite ready to face what's next. Every night, the light on the porch of the Pinewood Rest Motel stayed on. Because somewhere on Highway 17, on any given night, someone was driving through the dark, trying to figure out if things were going to be okay. And Claudette Marsh had decided, the way her mother had decided 31 years before her, quietly, without announcement, without asking for credit, that when they looked over and saw a light on, they would know that somebody was awake, and the door would open. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone, if it made you think about the lights that were left on for you, please leave a comment below. Tell us who your Sylvie was. We want to know. And if you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Subscribe to Ultra Stories, because every week we bring you stories exactly like this one. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the quietest possible way. We'll see you in the next one.